We have major breaking legal news. The Trump Justice Department has now indicted former FBI Director James Comey. This is in Virginia by a grand jury tonight. He is charged with 2 criminal counts. MSNBC reporting those charges. ABC News reporting the 2 counts are false statements and obstruction of justice. We do not have the actual indictment paper yet, and this is a developing breaking story. It also comes after reports of unusual and extreme pressure from the president on that department's office, basically after the acting U.S. attorney for that same district departed, and allegedly there is internal memoranda that doubted whether this new indictment of James Comey should even go forward. Prosecutors reportedly finding there was insufficient evidence. But now, former FBI Director Comey indicted tonight, capping a many-year saga of his criticism and clashes with President Trump and questions hanging over the validity of this kind of case. I'm joined by MSNBC Justice correspondent Ken Dilanian. Ken?
Ari, good to be with you. So the indictment, we just got word that it happened. It was handed down by this grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia after the case was presented to the grand jury for several hours this afternoon, we are told. And the 2 counts, as you mentioned, making false statements and obstruction of justice. We don't have the details, so we don't know if it's, as we have assumed, that it would be connected to the statement that James Comey made to the Senate 5 years ago that was closing in on the statute of limitations lapsing on Tuesday. That was a statement where he was asked whether he had authorized leaks to the media, and he said he did not. And there was an account given by his deputy, Andrew McCabe, that differed from that. This has been known for years, by the way, and explored in an Inspector General report, among other things. We are reporting that career prosecutors in that office did not believe there was enough evidence to proceed with this case. And they even wrote a memo to the acting U.S. Attorney, Lindsay Halligan, saying as much and saying that not only do they not think they could get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt from a jury, but they said that there wasn't probable cause to move forward with the case, which is the standard for a grand jury indictment. But obviously this grand jury found otherwise. Of course, as our viewers probably know, the grand jury process is essentially a tool of prosecutors. Right. Grand jurors do not hear from the defense. They don't hear from the defendant. They hear only what the prosecutors want them to hear. And so, you know, there's an old saying that a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich. And in this case, they've indicted the former FBI director on false statement charges Ken, that a lot of people think are specious.
This is an extraordinarily unusual process that led up to this. The President of the United States publicly calling for the Comey indictment by name, interfering or meddling. It could be a case for selective prosecution, but you need more evidence. We need to learn more. But the breaking news tonight, 2 counts, false statements and obstruction, and the unusual lead up. Where does that put this case? What footing is it on going forward, given that extraordinary intervention by Donald Trump and him all but admitting that he wanted this done, that he wanted this against what he views as a foe, separate from perhaps the legal evidence?
Oh, extraordinary is a good word for it, Ari. It's unprecedented. We've never seen this before in post-Watergate American history and probably pre-Watergate American history. A president publicly calling for his Justice Department to charge particular individuals. That's what happened. And then this particular individual, James Comey, was charged. And it happened after the U.S. attorney in this district, who had been appointed by Donald Trump and who we have reported was raising questions about this case, was forced out of office by Donald Trump. So the stage is set here for a federal judge to take a look at this and say that this was not appropriate. But you're right. That's an argument, a legal argument that James Comey's lawyers will have to make to the judge that draws the case, and they'll have to present evidence. And a lot, I think, will depend on the strength of the evidence in this indictment. Because as you know, vindictive prosecution is one matter. That's not something that goes before the jury. If the case is strong enough, oftentimes that can be overcome because essentially, if the evidence is there, the mindset of the prosecutor is less important. In this case, we believe the evidence is thin, and there's ample evidence that Donald Trump orchestrated this matter by replacing the U.S. attorney and then, lobbying his attorney general.
Yeah, and as you say, pressure on the Attorney General and changing the person in charge of an office that, according to reporting, had recently come to the opposite conclusion. There wasn't a case. Ken, reporting on a major development. Please stay with us. I want to bring in former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, who has overseen exactly such an office for the Department of Justice. Your response to this news tonight?
Well, of course, I think people are stunned given the president's involvement in this case and Ken's reporting that senior prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia felt the case shouldn't go forward. But Ari, we haven't seen the indictment yet. There is some reporting that it's a 2-count indictment. It will be important to see the substance of those charges before we evaluate them. And of course, to see the opening moves that Comey's legal team makes in response to this.
When you look at the legal team's opening response, where would they want to start? Walk us through that process. And given the primacy of former FBI Chief Comey, who ultimately testified basically about Donald Trump's efforts to then take what he called more direct control or possible interference with law enforcement, with the FBI that he ran. Now he's on the other end of that arm, the DOJ and the FBI. What would be the first steps we're going to see next from his side?
So full disclosure, I've never been a criminal defense lawyer, but I've worked with plenty of them. And I think that they'll look both at the substance of the case. They'll want to understand what the charges are. They'll want to get discovery. A very important issue when you've got prosecutions involving false statements and obstruction is that the statements that a defendant is charged with making have to be material. That means they have to be important to the outcome of the proceeding that they were made during. So there will be that focus. They'll get discovery pretty early in this case. The Eastern District of Virginia is a rocket docket. Things move very quickly there. So they'll be looking for that information.
And as you're saying that, I'm going to tell, pardon my interruption, Joyce, I'm going to tell viewers, we just saw a few people run out of that very courthouse. We can't say from witnessing it whether they're running for this or a different case, of course. I don't know yet. But you are seeing some activity there that is later than normal hours there, approaching the 7 p.m. hour. And we are awaiting, of course, getting the paper. If there's an indictment, that's a government process. It'll be released according to normal course. So we're seeing some flurry of activity there. Joyce, please continue your point.
Yes, that suggests that the clerk's office has just docketed something that was of interest to people who may not have accessed it on the government's PACER system. We'll see if that was the indictment itself. The other thing that the defense will be interested in this case, of course, will be pursuing what you and I talked about earlier, this idea that there might be motions to dismiss any prosecution because of selective and vindictive prosecution. Those should likely play out before a trial would be set in this case. Those will be among the sorts of preliminary motions that whichever judge this is assigned to will consider.
We have a brand new statement posted online from the Attorney General, Pam Bondi. As recently as today, there were reports that she was also doubtful about this case. While she doesn't mention it by name, I'll read exactly what you see here. No one is above the law. Today's indictment reflects DOJ's commitment to holding those who abuse positions of power accountable for misleading the American public. That is how she puts it. Again, the effort on and the attention on misleading, that rising, according to the DOJ indictment, to what they're going to argue is a criminal level. A false statements charge, which Joyce Vance, you were just explaining, requires meeting a certain bar of materiality. We don't have the indictment yet, but the reporting prior was that this was reference to Comey answering a question about the general news and leaks policy at DOJ and basically whether he was fully briefed on Clinton-related matters. With our final 30 seconds, your final thoughts.
Well, look, I think this is a good moment for us to all, before we jump to conclusions, wait to see the indictment, wait to see the response from Jim Comey's team. There are still barriers in the criminal justice system that prevent miscarriage of justice. A grand jury has decided that they will issue an indictment here, apparently. But there are other issues going forward, including a judge and a jury. Let's let the system work like it's intended to.
Right.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Donald Trump's Department of Justice announced this evening that former FBI Director James Comey has been indicted by a grand jury on 2 counts. making a false statement and obstruction. Now, the charges stem from Comey's testimony before Congress back on September 30th, 2020, and that specific date is very important because the statute of limitations on these charges is 5 years, which means the last possible date to charge Comey with this crime, lying during that testimony, would be September 30th, 2025. That is next Tuesday. In a statement, the brand new U.S. attorney prosecuting Comey, Lindsay Halligan, fresh on the job, having never, ever prosecuted a single case, wrote, quote, "The balance of power is a bedrock principle of our democracy. It relies upon accountability and a forthright presentation of facts from executive leadership to congressional oversight," misspelling the word principle. In a post on social media, Attorney General Pam Bondi said today, quote, "Today's indictment reflects this Department of Justice's commitment to holding those who abuse positions of power accountable for misleading the American people." FBI Director Kash Patel said, quote, "For far too long, previous corrupt leadership and their enablers weaponized federal law enforcement, damaging once proud institutions and severely eroding public trust." Of course, that is exactly what is happening here. Donald Trump's administration and the enablers around it are very clearly and forthrightly abusing federal law enforcement in a way that we have not ever seen, at least since Nixon and probably before then, to punish political opponents, people who say things they don't like, people who have taken political actions they don't like, or law enforcement actions they do not like. Trump can barely even bring himself to deny that he is personally directing these investigations and indictments.
It seems like an indictment on James Comey is imminent. Would this be the first step in accountability for pushing the hoax of Russia, along with Barack Obama involved as well?
Well, I can't tell you what's going to happen because I don't know. You have very professional people headed up by the Attorney General, and Todd Blanche, and Lindsay Halligan, who's a very smart, good lawyer, very good lawyer. They're going to make a determination. I'm not making that determination. I think I'd be allowed to get involved if I want, but I don't really choose to do so. I can only say that Comey's a bad person. He's a sick person. I think he's a sick guy, actually. He did terrible things at the FBI. But I don't know. I have no idea what's going to happen.
Okay, I want to be crystal clear here. All of the reporting we have, and we're going to have one of our own reporters who first broke this story, indicates that when Donald Trump says, "I don't know, I have no idea," that that's a lie, that he's lying about that. That was him today in the Oval Office, because we know that he has been directing this behind the scenes and, in fact, often publicly. This case against Comey is being brought in the Eastern District of Virginia. The previous U.S. attorney there, a career prosecutor, a guy chosen by Trump named Eric Siebert, a guy who had a good working relationship with Emil Bovee, who was the number 3 at Department of Justice, who prosecuted immigrant gangs like the president wanted. Well, he was pushed out last week. And the reason he was pushed out, in part, is because Siebert opposed bringing charges against Comey. And because of that, he was then swiftly replaced with the new U.S. Attorney, Lindsay Halligan, who we just mentioned. Now, Lindsay Halligan is a Florida insurance attorney with no prosecutorial experience. She was once Trump's personal lawyer. Halligan was sworn in on Monday, and I have to say, today is a big day for Lindsay Halligan, who has now secured her first ever indictment. She went 2 for 3. The grand jury rejected one of the charges, but she's never done that before, so it's a big professional milestone for Lindsay Halligan today to get these 2 indictments because she's never, ever, ever done that before. It's now Thursday. James Comey has now been indicted, just like she was obviously appointed to do. It's clear as day what's happening here, right? In his first term, Trump tried to get James Comey to turn the historically independent FBI into a tool to protect his friends and punish his enemies. Specifically, he wanted Comey to drop the investigation against Trump's former national security advisor, Mike Flynn, for lying to the FBI. And now, 8 years later, Trump's new Department of Justice is going after Comey, they say, for lying to Congress, but really it looks like because the president has it out for him. Carol Lennox, an MSNBC investigative reporter. She was the first to report that Comey may be indicted along with Ken Delanian, and she joins me now. You know, Carol, the temptation when this news breaks and we have an indictment in front of us is to sort of go through the facts and the details here. But to me, that's a small part of a story that is much larger in context here because of you and Ken's great reporting about how we got to this point. As the person that reported out, how significant is this moment?
I'll use the words, Chris, that prosecutors and federal investigators are saying to me tonight, which is simply chilling. Chilling because a seasoned prosecutor who was appointed by the Trump administration, chosen by Donald Trump and his allies, looked at the facts in this case and said there wasn't a sufficient reasonable basis to bring it and was resisting bringing it, was pressured to resign or be forced out, thrown out on the curb, and he chose to resign. Days later, a person with no prosecutorial experience is the U.S. attorney, and these charges are brought. What's important here for people to understand is that prosecutors have a duty not just to see if they can get 23 people to say, yes, we agree with a one-sided version and we will indict this person. The duty is to bring cases only when you can sustain a conviction and when it is righteous. And in this case, there's serious questions about whether this is either a righteous case or has the facts that can sustain a conviction.
On that note, I mean, one of the details, which is like a sort of asterisk, but I think is a very big one, is it appears that they were only able to secure 2 of 3 charges from a grand jury. Again, the grand jury process is incredibly favorable to prosecution. They don't hear the other side. The standard is not, beyond a reasonable doubt, obviously. Rejecting charges before a grand jury is extremely rare, but has become more common under this Department of Justice. And even today, in this case, it appears 1 of the 3 charges was rejected by the grand jury.
That's right. And Chris, to be fair, we do not know what that 3rd charge was.
Correct.
Ken and I reported when we were reporting and breaking the news that his indictment was, or the attempt to indict him was imminent and would likely come today. When we were reporting that, we heard that there were 2 theories of this case that witnesses were being asked about and that were being pursued, at least by Lindsay Halligan and maybe 1 or 2 other prosecutors in the office. And that was, 1, that he had lied in his September 2020 testimony to the Senate when asked whether or not he had authorized a leak about an investigation to anyone. And then the second was that there was a question about his handling of classified information or handling of a classified document. I'm not saying that's what the 3rd charge is,
right,
but it is something that was being asked about and pursued. And now here we are with a third criminal charge we don't know about that was declined. And of course, the 2 charges here, Chris, just to reemphasize them, are false statements to Congress and then obstruction of a congressional proceeding by providing those false statements.
I want to just, we just got a video that has been posted, I believe, to Instagram by James Comey, of course, the former FBI director who has just been indicted. I think we have that ready to roll if you want to just take a look.
My family and I have known for years that there are costs to standing up to Donald Trump, but we couldn't imagine ourselves living any other way. We will not live on our knees, and you shouldn't either. Somebody that I love dearly recently said that fear is the tool of a tyrant, and she's right. But I'm not afraid, and I hope you're not either. I hope instead you are engaged, you are paying attention, and you will vote like your beloved country depends upon it, which it does. My heart is broken for the Department of Justice, but I have great confidence in the federal judicial system, and I'm innocent. So let's have a trial and keep the faith.
Well, that was James Comey posting to Instagram. He was quoting there a memo written by his daughter, Maureen Comey, who was a prosecutor in the New York, Southern District of New York, where she starting to prosecute Jeffrey Epstein and successfully prosecuted Ghislaine Maxwell. She was fired, Carol, with no cause given. She's filed a lawsuit for that. But interesting there, the citation of his daughter and quoting her departing memo.
Well, now the phrase trumped up charges has new meaning. Donald Trump has delivered what is literally the thinnest federal indictment you will ever see. It amounts to 2 pages only because The two counts, so-called, in this thin indictment are the same count, the same so-called crime, which we will show you in a moment, James Comey's testimony to the Senate. And so they use that same sentence that James Comey gave in his testimony to create these two different so-called counts. The first count is what this indictment calls that he made materially false and fictitious fraudulent statement to the United States Senate. That is not something that Donald Trump has ever taken seriously before now. And then they use that same so-called false statement to constitute an obstruction charge, obstruction of the United States Senate. That's what this indictment is. We've literally never seen anything like it in any way, either one of those counts. James Comey responded to the indictment tonight with this video.
My family and I have known for years that there are costs to standing up to Donald Trump, but we couldn't imagine ourselves living any other way. We will not live on our knees, and you shouldn't either. Somebody that I love dearly recently said that fear is the tool of a tyrant, and she's right. But I'm not afraid, and I hope you're not either. I hope instead you are engaged, you are paying attention, and you will vote like your beloved country depends upon it, which it does. My heart is broken for the Department of Justice, but I have great confidence in the federal judicial system, and I'm innocent. So let's have a trial and keep the faith.
When James Comey referred to his family in that statement, he obviously is including his daughter, Maureen Comey, former federal prosecutor who was fired by Donald Trump and Donald Trump's Justice Department. She was the lead prosecutor in the Ghislaine Maxwell prosecution. She is the federal prosecutor who knew more about Ghislaine Maxwell and her prosecution than anyone else, and Ghislaine Maxwell's co-conspirator in sex trafficking, Jeffrey Epstein. Donald Trump made sure that she was fired before Donald Trump sent his criminal defense lawyer, his personal criminal defense lawyer, to Florida to interview Ghislaine Maxwell, now that Donald Trump's personal criminal defense lawyer is his deputy attorney general. He had to make sure that Maureen Comey was out of the way before he did that. That's one of the people James Comey referred to tonight in that video statement, and that quote, that line that he used, fear is the tool of a tyrant, is what his daughter, Maureen Comey, said when she was fired by the Justice Department in an email to her colleagues. She said, if a career prosecutor can be fired without reason, fear may seep into the decisions of those who remain. Do not let that happen. Fear is the tool of a tyrant, wielded to suppress independent thought. Instead of fear, let this moment fuel the fire that already burns at the heart of this place. A fire of righteous indignation at abuses of power, of commitment to seek justice for victims, of dedication to truth above all else. Donald Trump does not often delete social media posts. That is the rarest thing Donald Trump can do with a social media post, but he did it. He did it with the social media post in which he ordered his attorney general to bring this prosecution to his attorney general publicly. Pam, I have reviewed over 30 statements and posts saying that essentially same old story as last time, all talk, no action, nothing is being done. What about Comey, Adam Shifty Schiff, Letitia? They're all guilty as hell. And there is Donald Trump pronouncing guilt on James Comey while he's ordering his attorney general to make James Comey a criminal defendant. There's Donald Trump telling all of those grand jurors who heard this case, all of them, that James Comey is guilty as hell. That's Donald Trump telling the entire jury pool that will be considered for this case in the Eastern District of Virginia, that James Comey is guilty as hell. That is something that no president has ever done before Donald Trump. There was a moment when President Richard Nixon let slip publicly that he thought Charles Manson was guilty of those mass murders in Los Angeles, and President Nixon had to immediately retract that in a statement in writing for fear that that would create a mistrial in the prosecution of Charles Manson, and for fear that that would create prejudicial publicity that could harm Charles Manson ever getting a free trial, a fair trial in this country. Donald Trump has thrown that convention aside with his declaration that James Comey was guilty before James Comey was indicted. This is now all about this exchange that James Comey had with Senator Rafael Cruz in the Senate Judiciary Committee almost exactly 5 years ago tonight. Here is that exchange in its entirety. This is the entire body of evidence in this case. Here it is.
On May 3rd, 2017, in this committee, Chairman Grassley asked you point blank, quote, "Have you ever been an anonymous source in news reports about matters relating to the Trump investigation or the Clinton investigation?" You responded under oath, quote, "Never." He then asked you, quote, "Have you ever authorized someone else at the FBI to be an anonymous source in news reports about the Trump investigation or the Clinton administration?" You responded again under oath, "No." Now, as you know, Mr. McCabe, who works for you, has publicly and repeatedly stated that he leaked information to the Wall Street Journal and that you were directly aware of it and that you directly authorized it. Now, what Mr. McCabe is saying and what you testified to this committee cannot both be true. One or the other is false. Who's telling the truth?
I can only speak to my testimony. I stand by what the testimony you summarized that I gave in May of 2017.
So your testimony is you've never authorized anyone to leak. And Mr. McCabe, if he says contrary, is not telling the truth. Is that correct?
Again, I'm not going to characterize Andy's testimony, but mine is the same today.
The problem for Donald Trump and his inexperienced new prosecutor leading this prosecution is that the Department of Justice, in their Inspector General's investigation of this exact issue, found that James Comey was indeed telling the truth. Here is what the Inspector General's report has to say about exactly what Senator Cruz was just asking about. The Inspector General says, "We found that in late October 2016, McCabe authorized special counsel to discuss with Wall Street Journal reporter Devlin Barrett issues related to the FBI's Clinton Foundation investigation." So there's the Inspector General report saying, we found that McCabe authorized the discussion with the Wall Street Journal. McCabe authorized those two words. The jury in this case is going to see those two words. The grand jury in this case is very unlikely to ever have been presented with a single word of what you're about to hear right now. It is very unlikely that they ever showed the grand jury in this case the Inspector General's report, which goes on to say, in particular, McCabe authorized special counsel to disclose to Barrett the contents of a telephone call that had occurred on August 12, 2016, between McCabe and then Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General. We found that in a conversation with then Director Comey shortly after the Wall Street Journal article was published, McCabe lacked candor when he told Comey or made statements that led Comey to believe that McCabe had not authorized the disclosure and did not know who did. We also found that on May 9th, 2017, when questioned under oath by FBI agents from the Inspector General's office, McCabe lacked candor when he told the agents that he had not authorized the disclosure to the Wall Street Journal and did not know who did. We additionally found that on November 29th, 2017, when questioned under oath by the Inspector General in a recorded interview during which he contradicted his prior statements by acknowledging that he had authorized the disclosure to the Wall Street Journal. McCabe lacked candor when he stated that he told Comey on October 31st, 2016, that he had authorized the disclosure to the Wall Street Journal. And so there is the evidence that was no doubt withheld and deliberately withheld from this grand jury. It is inconceivable that a grand jury could read those passages of the Inspector General's report and then say that James Comey was somehow not telling the truth.
One thing has been very, very clear over the last week, and probably even before then, Donald Trump wasn't going to stop until he found someone who would go ahead with his plan to indict James Comey. And he found that someone in Lindsay Halligan. Now, if you did not know who Lindsay Halligan was before today, I don't really blame you. Maybe you'd heard her name, but maybe you don't know a lot about her. She was only just sworn in as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia on Monday. Up until a week ago, she was the person Trump put in charge of reducing the amount of mentions of things like, say, slavery at the Smithsonian Museum in D.C. And this is how she defended that work.
What I saw when I was going through the museums personally was an overemphasis on slavery. And I think there should be more of an overemphasis on how far we've come since slavery. Our country is a country of progress, and it's the greatest country in the world. And we should be able to take our kids, our students through the Smithsonian and feel proud when we leave. There's a lot of history to our country, both positive and negative, but we need to keep moving forward. We can't just keep focusing on the negative.
Okay, let me just note, that clip is from about a month ago, so it's not an ancient clip, about a month ago. And that is the person Donald Trump found to prosecute a case against the former director of the FBI, one he has been wanting to happen for a long time. Joining me now is Andrew Weissman, MSNBC legal analyst and former top prosecutor for the Justice Department. Andrew, you are the person I wanted to talk to most, and I think everybody watching wanted to hear what they thought, given your history and your just incredible ability to explain things. I want to know your thoughts, just in general, given I think this moment really leaps over what we've seen in the past. How are you digesting it?
There's so much here, but let's start with, we do not know, and the indictment doesn't tell us exactly what the specifics are as to why the government and now the grand jury believes that there's probable cause for these two charges. And so we really have to await that. In other words, let's see whether there are any facts to support what has happened here. And by the way, if there were the crime of making false statements to Congress or obstructing Congress, those are serious. And it doesn't matter that it's the former head of the FBI any more than it mattered when it was Donald Trump as the former president, who was indicted himself for obstructing justice not once but twice in the Florida case. So that's sort of to one side, but the real story, I agree with you, Jen, is about the process here. Let me just take you inside what would normally happen. Leave aside the whole part about that you now have a new U.S. attorney. You've covered that. But let me just tell you what a new U.S. attorney would want to do and would happen in any major case, which is you would sit down and look at the evidence. You would meet with your prosecutors and understand their reservations. The reporting is that the career people did not think that there was enough to go forward here. Remember, they have to be able to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. You'd also want to afford the opportunity to Jim Comey and his legal team to hear their position. And only after that would you make a decision. And there's no evidence that that entire process happened in the New York Minute that Ms. Halligan has been in her position. So that's just one more, I would say, significant sort of due process foul that's going on here. And I think the proof in the pudding here is going to be, in sort of looking forward, is I think there's a really good chance that James Comey and his legal team will ask for a speedy trial. They have a right to a trial within 30 days of today. And they could ask for a speedy trial. I did note that Jim Comey has already been on Instagram and said, let's have a trial. And to me, that suggests that if they really think that there is no there, we don't know the answer to that. But if they presumably do, we could see in 30 days all of this blowing up in Donald Trump's face. And everything that he thinks is a victory now is going to really show that this is the emperor has no clothes, that this is the abuse that it appears to be.
There, I should note, I'm not a lawyer. I've learned from all of you, but there is a tremendous leap from an indictment to a conviction. I think everybody watching knows that. Last night, I was talking with Preet. We knew even less last night, so I should just note that. And we were talking about, though, kind of the case that his lawyers could make, to your point. And he was kind of laid out the notion that Comey could allege, potentially, depending, selective and vindictive prosecution. What would that entail? What do you think of that? And if they made that argument, what would that entail?
So those are very hard arguments to make, but I would say is if it's ever going to work for vindictive prosecution, this looks like it. And so vindictive prosecution is where you are looking for someone being singled out for impermissible reasons. And so just because you did your job, but just because you referred the president or you opened an investigation into the president, those are not legitimate reasons to have a sort of tit for tat. And so that kind of claim, again, could really blow up in Donald Trump's face. Imagine if that motion, I think, will certainly be made. Imagine the judge in this case, who's a very, very experienced judge, who's been on the bench either as a magistrate or a district judge appointed by President Obama to the district court, holding a hearing on this. Imagine what that would look like where Jim Comey gets to put witnesses on. This is the kind of thing where, I don't know that the White House really thought through sort of giving James Comey this forum to be heard, where he is going to be able to potentially call witnesses and have a trial. And as I said, I really think this is one where this is such a horrendous moment for the rule of law, for the Department of Justice, for the country writ large. But I do think that there is the potential for a little like we saw with Mr. Kimmel, that this with Jimmy Kimmel, is that we could see a reversal here where in a matter of weeks where we see sort of real pushback by the judge, by a jury, in terms of at a hearing, in terms of what happens here. So as bad as tonight is in terms of the rule of law in America and sort of going down the road of a sort of Nixonian Hoover type use of the legal system, this is one where I do have sort of cautious optimism if there really is no there, that the system will hold.
I think I am happy to hear that. I think a lot of people watching are happy to hear that. And 30 days would be a very quick turnaround, or would feel like a quick turnaround. Let me ask you, since I have you, about a couple things. We're trying to understand all the different details that have been reported out and whether it's significant or not, and you can tell us. So we know that Halligan has never prosecuted a criminal case of any kind before. And according to NBC, she filed multiple charging documents in the same case, which she told the judge when the judge asked her about them, she had not seen. Her signature was on them. Is that a normal thing that could happen? Is that a sign of inexperience, or how do you read that?
Well, in order to sign the indictment, the U.S. attorney, the sitting U.S. attorney, has to sign. And presumably she's not saying that she didn't see the document she signed. But a lot of times there are people who are lower level who sign on behalf of the U.S. attorney. So I wouldn't take, there's so many things to be upset about. That's not the one that I would get really upset about.
That's important. That's why we ask you these sorts of questions, Andrew Weissmann. We're covering this very closely. I'm so grateful for you for staying up with us and helping people understand what to follow, what to pay attention to, and what not. Thank you again.
My pleasure.
So, Ken Dilanian, what happens from here? We just said the arraignment will be October 9th, but what happens to James Comey today, this weekend, over the next several days? Where does this case go?
We're still reporting this out, Willie. There was some talk last night that Comey was going to surrender for processing at an FBI office in the Eastern District of Virginia today. This morning, we're still trying to figure out whether that's going to happen, because it's not necessarily true that he has to do that now that the arraignment has been set in front of Judge Nachmanoff. But a lot of legal experts are looking at this and saying this case may never get to trial, because there's going to be all of the things that Donald Trump did on social media, both before and after the bringing of these charges, will be the subject of motions to this judge for vindictive and malicious prosecution, for improper pretrial publicity. Look, the Trump administration was just chastised in the Luigi Mangione case for making improper pretrial statements, the Attorney General and the President and others. This post on social media excoriating James Comey is going to be Exhibit A in that kind of motion. And so this judge is going to have a lot of work to do before this case ever gets to a jury adjudicating some of these claims. And, you know, looking at James Comey's pre-recorded video reminded me, because I covered him when he was the FBI director, he is a charismatic and eloquent figure, whatever you think of him. He's a great talker. And unafraid to communicate publicly. He used to have weekly roundtables where he would answer any question from reporters. That's something Chris Wray never did and Kash Patel never thought of doing. And what the Trump administration has done here is they've given this man a giant megaphone now that he didn't have before. And that may be something they regret down the line, guys.
Again, it's just, it bears repeating. You do this, you turn the person you hate into a martyr. You make them bigger than ever. You unite people behind them. Donald Trump understood this in his own political campaign, and yet he's now making Comey a martyr for the rule of law. That will be the first line in his obituary, that he was an FBI director, but that he became a martyr because a president said on social media to an attorney general, go and arrest this guy for the first time in our lifetime. And so now the world looks at James Comey and they see that he is a political and a legal martyr. Nobody thought that way yesterday, but they sure as hell are going to think that way today and tomorrow and into the future. And again, if you don't believe me, again, just go back to the 2024 campaign and look how the Republican Party was ready to move on to a certain Florida governor, and then the indictment started coming down against Donald Trump, and that brought the Republican Party together behind him and eventually led him to be elected the next president of the United States. This is not hard. And yet the White House keeps making the same mistake. Jimmy Kimmel, record numbers. Right. I mean, talk about going viral. It's extraordinary what Donald Trump did for Jimmy Kimmel's career and what he has now done for James Comey's reputation. That's the political side of it. Really quickly before we go, I want to ask you first, Danny, and then I'll get to Barb on the prosecutor's side. But as a defense attorney, Danny, tell me, what would you do if you had the President of the United States saying to his Attorney General, this guy is my political enemy, arrest him, he's got to be put in jail, he's guilty as hell, saying something along those lines, he's guilty as hell, he's one of the worst people in the world, time's running out, you remember that one? Time's running out, it's statute of limitation, you gotta do it now, we've gotta bust this guy. Okay, I've just put the ball on the tee and given you a bat to hit with it. What would you do hitting that ball off the tee? It seems like an open and shut case, doesn't it?
Well, let's start with the primary defenses. Attack the statute. The defense is going to be this was not a material statement, this was not a false statement, and even if it wasn't a knowingly false statement. But then we get into what you just described, and I expect you will see a motion for dismissal based on selective prosecution. The problem is all federal prosecution is selective, and these motions have a very, very small chance of winning. That being said, this is probably the best case ever for a selective prosecution motion. But be warned, they are not often successful because, after all, that's what federal prosecutors do. They have limited jurisdiction, so theirs is a sort of selective process. They can't prosecute everything that falls within all federal criminal statutes, so they have to look around and decide where to focus their resources. And that, the government will argue when this motion comes, is exactly what they did in this case. The problem for them is going to be the paper trail of evidence. Not so much things like the U.S. attorney is inexperienced, but far more compelling is the public statements that the president has made saying, get this person. But again, I'll say it for the third time, be warned, that part of the defense is probably, as crazy as it sounds, the weaker part. The better defense for Comey is to attack the charges themselves. My statements weren't false, they weren't material, and even if they were untrue, they weren't made knowingly. That's his best shot.
They've already been investigated. And yet, Barb, while this doesn't usually work, you usually don't have a president ordering his attorney general to arrest a political enemy. Let me say that again. You usually don't have a United States president ordering the Attorney General of the United States of America to charge and arrest a political opponent of his. In public. We had it here. Tell me, what judge is not going to look at that and say, why are you wasting my time here? You want to have your political fights, do it, but do it outside of this courtroom. This is a disgrace. What judge would not do that?
Yeah, just to pick up on Danny's definition of selective prosecution, it is true that prosecutors exercise discretion in choosing which cases to bring, but there is case law that due process is violated when prosecutions are selected on an arbitrary basis and not a legitimate law enforcement basis. And one of those prohibited bases is political motivation. Now, as Danny said, it's rarely successful because it's very difficult to prove the motivation of a prosecutor. If you've got the evidence, usually that's enough. But in this case, as you said, with this incredible paper trail,
exactly.
I think it might be pretty easy for a defense attorney. So if I'm a prosecutor in this case, God forbid, I cringe every time I see one of these posts from Donald Trump because he has just made the defense case easier.
We begin today with the message of defiance from the former director of the FBI, whose indictment last night marks a radical turn, a literal hinge point in which our country ceased adhering to one of the central tenets of life in a democracy. So begins an ugly new chapter in which an unpopular ruler purges his own political party of prosecutors until he arrives at the weakest link in the chain. That link willing to do what two Republican prosecutors in good standing with MAGA refused to do over a series of years. Here's former FBI Director Jim Comey hours after news broke that he'd been indicted by a grand jury on 2 counts.
My family and I have known for years that there are costs to standing up to Donald Trump, but we couldn't imagine ourselves living any other way. We will not live on our knees, and you shouldn't either. Somebody that I love dearly recently said that fear is the tool of a tyrant, and she's right. But I'm not afraid, and I hope you're not either. I hope instead you are engaged, you are paying attention, and you will vote like your beloved country depends upon it, which it does. My heart is broken for the Department of Justice, but I have great confidence in the federal judicial system, and I'm innocent. So let's have a trial and keep the faith.
Comey there is referring to a letter his daughter, Maureen Comey, wrote to her colleagues in the Southern District of New York when she was fired from her job there. Fear, though, is Donald Trump's favored weapon as his administration blows through decades of norms and traditions and begins to actually prosecute Donald Trump's critics, something Trump has wanted to do since his first term. Brand new reporting from MSNBC reveals that it is not clear if there was any prosecutor in the office willing to argue this case. And MSNBC also reports this now, quote, prosecutors in the Eastern District were confiding to each other late Thursday night that Trump's new appointee will have a difficult time finding even one assistant U.S. attorney in her office to help her take Comey to trial. After all, just a few days ago, according to ABC News and later confirmed by MSNBC, prosecutors in U.S. Attorney Lindsay Halligan's office wrote a memo explaining that they did not have the evidence to indict Jim Comey, much less secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. But Halligan went ahead anyway, as Trump directed her to do. The flimsiness, the lack of evidence and facts in the case against Jim Comey, as it appears right now, shows us one thing important about the second Trump administration. It shows us that after years of being told no, Donald Trump has finally found the people who are willing to go after Jim Comey in a way he has wanted to do for years. What his hand-picked attorney general in his first term, Bill Barr, refused to do, and what the special counsel Barr appointed, John Durham, also found no evidence for and refused to do. Bill Barr actually wrote about Trump's hectoring him to indict Jim Comey in his book. And he wrote that he told Trump that if the Justice Department tried to prosecute Comey for handing memos about his conversations with Trump to his lawyers, it would, quote, be obviously vindictive and, quote, meet with quick defeat, end quote. Now, in his second term, Trump can say, quote, nothing is being done. What about Comey, Adam Shifty Schiff, and Letitia? He can force out a U.S. attorney with sterling Republican credentials and relationships in MAGA Republican circles, including atop Trump's DOJ, who refused to bring the case against Comey until he finds that weak link, one who says yes, and get an indictment of a critic he's been obsessed with for years in the matter of days. The indictment of Jim Comey, a flashing red warning sign for the health of democracy and the rule of law in the United States, is where we begin today with some of our most trusted friends and reporters. Ken Dilanian is here. He is the justice and intelligence correspondent for MSNBC. He's been tracking the story for us all week long and all day, and he has some major new developments on the workings of Trump's Department of Justice. Also with us, former Department of Justice pardon attorney Liz Oyer. She was fired by Trump's Justice Department in March after she refused to restore Mel Gibson's gun rights. And former federal prosecutor Brendan Ballou is also with us. Ken Dilanian, I understand you've got news. We start with you.
That's right, Nicole. I think you sketched out the big picture well and the large stakes here, but there's also the small picture, which is what the heck is this indictment actually about? Because there's so little detail in it. And we had assumed all day long that this indictment had to do with James Comey's relationship with his deputy, Andrew McCabe, and whether he authorized Andrew McCabe to leak a particular story to the Wall Street Journal. But it turns out that's not accurate. I've just confirmed from a source familiar that the main allegation of lying to Congress in this indictment has to do with the allegation that James Comey lied about whether he told his friend Dan Richman, who was at the time a special government employee at the FBI, whether he authorized him to be an anonymous source for reporters about stories about an FBI investigation into Hillary Clinton. So Richman would be person number 3 in the indictment, we are told, and Hillary Clinton would be person number 1. That sort of goes against what we thought this indictment was about, and it raises this question, because we don't know what the evidence is that the government has supporting their allegation that James Comey lied to Congress. Comey testified in 2017 that he never authorized anyone at the FBI to be an anonymous source for reporters. And then when he was asked about that again in this 2020 hearing, which is subject to this, which is within the statute of limitations, he said, "I stand by my 2017 testimony." So it appears that the government is saying that 2017 testimony was a lie. You repeated the lie in 2020. And the way they would prove that is if they had evidence that, in fact, Comey did authorize Dan Richman to talk to reporters about an investigation into Hillary Clinton back then. That's a very specific thing, and so it suggests to me that they think they have something. And it changes the way I am thinking about this indictment. It doesn't change, however, the big picture that you described, which is that this is a case that career prosecutors inside that office and the U.S. attorney in that office did not think was worthy of bringing forth as a criminal case. And in fact, Eric Siebert, the U.S. attorney, was essentially forced out because he resisted bringing this case and also the one against Tish James. And we have new news on that score. He had a deputy, a woman named Maya Song, a very well-regarded person within that office. She was demoted when he was fired to prevent her from becoming the interim U.S. attorney because she wouldn't bring the case either. Today we have learned, my colleague Carol Leonnig, reporting on her day off, has learned that Maya Song was fired today from the Justice Department. So that bit of news, adding to this picture that the White House has essentially seized control of this Justice Department, and any figment of independence that the Justice Department may have had from the White House has evaporated in the Trump administration.
Ken Delaney in the New York Times reported last Friday night that Mr. Richman had been interviewed, I think about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, ostensibly by Eric Siebert or his deputies. Do we know if he was interviewed again in the period after Siebert was forced out? Because I think there were accounts saying that he hadn't proved helpful in moving toward an indictment of Jim Comey.
Yeah, I mean, I would be careful about, the grand juries are secret, and I don't know for sure, but I have no reason to believe that Dan Richman was interviewed again, and he did not testify before the grand jury. He was only interviewed, which suggests, that usually suggests that they believe the witness wasn't, in fact, helpful. But there are also a lot of documents, don't forget, that Kash Patel is rummaging through in different rooms inside the FBI because they are obsessed, remember, with this Trump-Russia investigation and what happened and what James Comey did and what people like Dan Richman did. And so they're going through all these documents, and it's possible they found something that suggests to them that they think that Comey authorized Dan Richman to talk to reporters. And let's think about that. Does that matter in the scheme of things? And even if that's true, there would have to be evidence that Comey didn't just forget, but that he willfully and knowingly lied to Congress. Why would he do that? He's a lawyer, after all. He worked at the Justice Department before he was the FBI director. He willingly testified in public. And why would he knowingly lie to Congress about something that really wasn't all of that, it wasn't really germane to the topic at hand, which was the Trump-Russia investigation. That was that hearing back in 2020. So I think, even if they have something that suggests that's inconsistent with Comey's testimony, it's a long way from that to a criminal conviction on perjury and lying to Congress. And that, I think, explains why so many career prosecutors were against bringing this case, Nicole.
We begin today with the Department of Justice and moments that define a presidency and a country. In modern times, there was, of course, this moment during President Richard Nixon's presidency.
Good evening. The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history. The president has fired the man you just saw, the special Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox. Because of the president's action, the attorney general has resigned. Richardson's deputy, William Ruckelshaus, has been fired. All of this adds up to a totally unprecedented situation, a grave and profound crisis in which the president has set himself against his own attorney general and the Department of Justice.
A grave and profound crisis. As we know, that moment ultimately led to Nixon's resignation and was a turning point that shaped the Department of Justice for decades to come. The country essentially said that will never happen again. But now, with the indictment of former FBI Director James Comey, we appear to be at another one of these moments, with a sitting president openly pushing the DOJ for prosecutions of his perceived enemies and a DOJ leadership team that is willing to comply, despite the opposition of career DOJ prosecutors. In both cases, we have presidents using the power of the Justice Department to do what they want, whether to protect themselves or prosecute their perceived enemies. But one thing that differs at this point is that presently, the pushback is only coming from one side of the political aisle. And Trump has already forecasted that this is only the beginning.
Now that James Comey has been indicted, who is the next person on your list in this retribution?
It's not a list, but I think there'll be others. I mean, they're corrupt. There'll be others. Look, that's my opinion. They weaponized the Justice Department like nobody in history. What they've done is terrible. And so I hope there are others, because you can't let this happen to a country.
And speaking of those others, the New York Times reported just last night that the DOJ is seeking information on Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis. You remember her. She led the election interference case against Trump in Georgia. Quote, federal investigators have subpoenaed records related to travel they believe Fani Willis took around the time of last year's election, but it was not immediately clear why. But the document reviewed by the Times is an indication that the Justice Department under President Trump may be investigating another one of his old foes. And late last night, Attorney General Pam Bondi backed up Trump's threats that there will be others when she had this to say.
Whether you're a former FBI director, whether you're a former head of an intel community, whether you are a current state or local elected official, whether you're a billionaire funding organizations to try to keep Donald Trump out of office, everything is on the table. We will investigate you, and we will end the weaponization.
Everything's on the table. Joining us now, former federal prosecutor Paul Butler, who is also an MSNBC legal analyst and Georgetown law professor, and New York Times D.C. correspondent covering the Justice Department, Glenn Thrush. Glenn, I want to start with you. This is something, when it comes to Comey, that Trump has wanted to do for nearly a decade at this point, right? He has been going after Comey for kind of starting the criminal background as Trump sees it. But the indictment that we have is vague. It was unclear whether it was about McCabe, and now it seems like, person number 3, as MSNBC has reported, is Richmond. So talk folks a little bit through what we have in this indictment and what it tells you about where this case is going.
Well, what's in the indictment is a very quick read. It is about 2 to 2.5 pages long. The only signature on it is Lindsay Halligan, the Trump former defense lawyer, who, without a minute of courtroom experience before she appeared in Alexandria Federal Court on Thursday, and it hinges on some testimony that Comey gave before the Senate Judiciary Committee in 2020. And we should just say the timing of this is not accidental or coincidental. On Tuesday, the statute of limitations for prosecuting Comey for lying to Congress expires. So there are 2 counts. It's really one crime, which is lying to Congress about whether or not he used a cutout, a staffer, to communicate confidential information to reporters. It is one of the thinnest indictments my colleagues at the paper can recall. It contains very, very little information about how Comey behaved, or in the allegation, misbehaved. And it doesn't even quote Comey directly. It quotes a paraphrase of Comey's testimony from Senator Ted Cruz. The general feeling on this, both inside and outside the federal prosecutor's office in Northern Virginia, is that it was a weak case. There isn't enough evidence to have brought this indictment, and the belief is generally that its prognosis moving forward is extraordinarily iffy.
Paul, one of my takeaways is that you can't indict a salami sandwich, but you can still indict a ham sandwich. Is that the point here, even though what Glenn lays out, that this is a very weak indictment, but potentially lacking real teeth for a conviction? Is that Do you think that that is this Justice Department's end game at the end of the day?
Totally. So to get a grand jury to indict, there have to be 12 out of the 23. So it's not a requirement for a unanimous verdict. It's the lowest standard of proof in the legal system. Probable cause, very different from a trial where you have to have a unanimous verdict again, and the jury has to find proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, 14 of the 23 grand jurors voted to indict. On 2 counts, there was a third count that they didn't vote to indict. So most prosecutors have never had a grand jury fail to indict ever. It's a very rigged system in favor of the prosecution. The defense attorney isn't allowed in the room. There's no judge, and the prosecutor isn't obligated to present evidence of innocence. So it's easy to get an indictment. They had a tough time there. We don't like to predict what's going to happen in a trial. I can tell you it's extremely unlikely that James Comey will ever be convicted of a crime.
Glenn, I want to get a little bit into the particulars of this indictment, which in it, you know, we don't know exactly who they are referring to when they're talking about this allegation that James Comey lied to Congress. We think that it's about a 2020 exchange that Comey had with Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. But what exactly do you know, does the New York Times know when it comes to who is referenced, who's person number 1, who's person number 3 in this indictment, and what allegation they're leveling against Comey?
Well, it appears from our reporting, and we've published this. Daniel Richman, I'm not sure which one is 2 or which is 3, but Daniel Richman, now a Columbia law professor, who we reported was subpoenaed in this case, and by the way, did not provide any information that appears to have compromised Comey, is one of them, and the other one appears to be former FBI official Andy McCabe. But let's look at the broader picture here. It is very difficult, you know, as we're kind of studying the legality of this and the evidentiary trail. I think to some extent you have to move beyond the 4 corners of this indictment and look at the politics. Lindsay Halligan was inserted into that position essentially on Trump's whim at his direction when Eric Siebert, his previous pick for that office, was ejected for not going along with this indictment. You know, what we are seeing here at every level of the system below Trump, and actually, just to kind of go back to Bondi's statement last night, you know, Bondi has this persona on Fox. And by the way, I should say she only appears on Fox. She has not sat down for an independent interview with us or anybody else. She appears to be very strongly behind all of this stuff. She projects this image of a tough prosecutor. In fact, our reporting shows that Bondi and her principal deputy, Todd Blanche, objected to Siebert's firing, and they warned the White House that the evidence in the Comey case and a mortgage fraud case against Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, was profoundly weak. And they attempted, I think, to sort of moderate what was going on last week. They were blindsided by the appointment of Lindsay Halligan. So this image that Bondi is attempting to project by speaking to Sean Hannity, who she considers to be one of her close friends, is in a sense, there's more than meets the eye here. There is dissension creeping up the ranks at the Justice Department, although as you know, the prime directive for all of these folks is to keep their job and to maintain their good relationship with Donald Trump.
And Paul, that prime directive came directly from the president, right? He posted on Truth Social, that feels like a million years ago, but just like last week, saying they needed to start indicting people, that time was running out, time being the fact that the statute of limitations on Comey was running out. I want to play some sound from Deputy AG Todd Blanche about how he and the Attorney General are thinking about what Trump said.
I appreciate that truth came out last week. We are working all day, hard every day. The Attorney General and I, Director Patel, to do everything that this president ran on to keep America safe and to make America safer. And so when the president says that he's reading things or that he wants us to do investigations and he wants us to do our job, the Attorney General does not take that as pressure. I don't take that as pressure.
It is literally pressure. The president of the United States isn't supposed to be saying anything to the attorney general, right? One of the things that Barack Obama has talked about and Comey has talked about in the past is that they met the one time and that was kind of it, right? When they did the interview and that was the end of that. But we're seeing this pressure campaign that Trump promised to do. He wanted to do it in Trump 1.0 and wasn't able to. But when it comes to the case against Comey, how easy is it to prove for his lawyers that this is a selective prosecution, that this is a vindictive prosecution, when there's all this evidence that the president of the United States ordered this prosecution?
So normally motions to dismiss a case based on vindictive prosecution lose because you have to provide evidence, the defendant does, of an ill motive by the prosecutor that she was vindictive or selective or political. And normally defendants can't find that kind of evidence. Here, there's a mountain of evidence. Last night, President Trump said they did this to me for 4 years. We have a social media order to the Attorney General of the United States. You got to do something now. We have the experienced prosecutor who he fired. This guy had been a prosecutor for 15 years. He said, DOJ regulations say we can't bring a case unless we can convince a jury. We're going to lose this case. Trump said it didn't matter, or Bondi said it didn't matter, so they insert their hand-picked person. Again, the person who said, based on his experience, they couldn't win the case, prosecuted for 15 years. The person who's bringing the case, who signed the indictment, today is Saturday, she's been a prosecutor for 6 days.